I've been working with nature. I was one of the back in College Park. We'll go way back. One of the few people back then that was in natural resource management, studying wildlife and plant biology back in the 80s. A lot of people that I went to school with didn't even know that that kind of major existed. But I'd always been drawn to nature. Always been a fly fisherman since I was real little. And my dad was really into the environment. I really got into this because I liked playing in the mud, really. And you can see I'm still doing it. But I'm going to tell you my story about how I came to befriend and really embrace the North American beaver. Some of the takeaways today, we'll talk about this idea that if you build it, they will come. And I'll explain that in the beginning of the talk. Talk about history and a lot of things that really blew my mind as far as how this country and even North America was founded and populated, way back when Europeans were moving over here. This idea that a lot of the wildlife that we cherish, ducks, trout, they all co-evolved with the North American beaver. And that's really important, and I'll tell you why. And then this idea that to engineer is human, but to do it right might require beaver is a quote from Tom Horton, has been on this journey with me. He's a writer, wrote for the Baltimore Sun and also many books on the Chesapeake Bay. But if we go back to the 1980s, actually, back in 1987, while I was I guess moving into my sophomore year in college, I went out and studied wolves in Glacier Park as they were moving back into North America from Canada, or back into the lower 48, excuse me. I've always been fascinated with wolves and how they can sort of come into a landscape, like when they were reintroduced, into Yellowstone back in the 90s. And all these wonderful things started happening to the environment. The willows started to come back, and the grizzly bears did better and the badgers did better. And why is that? Well, it's because what we call a wolf, like a trophic cascade or an apex predator. And when the wolf is in the landscape, deer and elk, what I call ungulates, they behave differently. A good analogy would be when we hike in a place that has grizzly bears, like Glacier National Park, we behave differently, don't we? Because there's something out there that can eat us. Well, wildlife does the same thing. And the wolves sort of instituted this behavioral change in elk and deer, and they started to act like elk and deer again instead of acting like cows. And we can see that here in Maryland. When you drive by deer, even in the city, and you can almost go up and pet them. Well, that's not natural, right? Deer they become accustomed to not having really any predators in the landscape. So I started thinking about wolves and their benefits, and I started thinking about, like, what kind of trophic cascade type of approach might help us to restore the Chesapeake Bay. And I started going back to projects that I worked on many years ago. This is a winter's run in Harford County. And what you're seeing is sort of a restoration project right after it's finished. And in addition to restoring and relocating this river, we also created a lot of wetlands and planted a lot of riparian or vegetation along the stream banks. I started going back to these sites, and it turned out like beaver had colonized a lot of them. We had basically sort of created great habitat for beavers, right? We had planted a lot of beaver food. We put an easement on these areas, and these guys kind of moved in and said, yeah, Ecotone, hey, I like what you did. Here's a reforestation project that we did in Harford County along Island Branch. You can see the tree shelters that we installed. And here's a tree shelter right in the middle of a beaver pond a couple of years later. And we didn't do anything other than plant trees, take livestock out of those low wetland areas. And, these beaver came in and they found it and they liked it. Here we are in Davis Branch. If you've ever been to the Howard County Conservancy, Davis Branch runs through there. And in this case, the beaver literally were coming into our project before we were even finished. So we'd have to take down the dam every morning, and they would come back every night and rebuild it. The idea that beaver are only, really applicable, Scott, you can only do this like out in Western Maryland where there's, it's very rural. Well, here we are in Montgomery Village. Underneath this beaver pond was a stream restoration project that Ecotone built a year and a half ago. So they move in very quickly sometimes. We tell landowners like, hey, this is great. I mean, you got waterfront property where you didn't before. We can coexist with these folks. But back to my story and back to about 2015, when I started thinking about beavers, I remember a guy named Joe Wheaton out in Utah would send me emails about a course he was on, workshop on how to use beaver for stream restoration. And I always thought that odd because, I thought beavers were bad, right? They're a nuisance, correct? But, I started to sort of change my thinking. I started going out west a lot to conferences to talk to experts and practitioners working with salmon restoration, working with restoration in the Pacific Northwest. The first workshop I went to was at this place called Bridge Creek in Eastern Oregon. And you can see from the photo, it's very xeric, very dry. Folks had done a 10-year study funded by NOAA. The whole objective was to improve habitat for salmon, right? And what they were doing was using actually beaver to do a lot of the restoration work. So there was no big equipment, with excavators moving rock around. If you've ever gone by Chinkapin Run in Baltimore these days, you can see what I'm talking about. Around here, we engineer things, right, with lots of stone. Out here, they were doing this project where they were building, let me skip forward, these beaver dam analogs, where they're basically creating man-made beaver dams to give the beaver sort of a jump start, because all the dams used to blow out. The stream was very narrow and deep. And by doing this, the beaver were able to really stick here in these areas. And you can see the wildlife and the riparian area is really where all the action is ecologically, right? I mean, look at the top of that hill there. There's not much going on. It's very dry. But down here, whoa, the salmon were doing better. Sage grouse were using this for habitat. And it was all, just using beaver. You have these steep hillsides where the scientists were actually trying to make these hillsides erode and direct the water into them to provide the sediment so that they could literally, over a very short period of time, several years, raise the whole stream bed back to interacting with its floodplain again. It's this idea of fighting fire with fire. So during the workshop, we got to build some beaver dam analogs. We got to play beaver for a day. It's really pretty simple. You put these posts in the stream, weave willow material and vegetation within those posts, and you kind of back up the water, and it gives that beaver a starter set, right? Where the water's a little bit deeper. And that's really why beaver build dams. It's so they feel safe from predation. So they like to have, they're terrible, very slow on the ground, but in the water, they're awesome swimmers. So that's where they feel safest. Here's some more slides of some beaver dam analogs that have been installed. These are mostly out in California. And, this idea that I used to have, honestly, that beaver dams were bad for fish. Well, think about trout and brook trout and beaver. They've co-evolved over the last million years, literally. So the brook trout and everything, they're able to make their way through these dams. It creates great holding habitat and juvenile rearing. So smaller fish have a lot more places to hide. And these dams actually push water back into the soil. So you're actually getting more groundwater recharge, right? It's this idea that was really coined in the 90s. A species like the beaver is a keystone species. In other words, so many other species of wildlife rely on the beaver. Think about ducks in the Eastern Flyway, right? Before we had farm ponds and cornfields for geese to land in, what did they land in 400 and 500 years ago? Beaver ponds, right? So in a beaver pond, there's so much activity and ecology going on. Without the beaver, things kind of fall apart. So it was at this workshop that I ran into somebody in the hotel lobby, and they said, "Well, Scott, you're from back east. By the way, I was the only one from the east these conferences, right?" They said, "Are you going to State of the Beaver?" And I said, "What's that?" Well, it's an international conference just on the North American beaver. So it's held in a casino out in Western Oregon every other year. So in 2017, I hit the State of the Beaver conference, and I met researchers and scientists and watershed stewards from all over the world that were doing all these wonderful things with beaver. I met folks from Belgium and Germany who are re-beavering Eurasia. And I found out that beaver, the North American has a cousin, the Eurasian beaver, castor fiber. And, they had beavers obviously in Russia, even Mongolia, and as far south as Italy historically. And it was also at this State of the Beaver conference that I met Mike Callahan. I misspoke earlier. Mike was actually also from the East Coast, but Mike's been working with beavers maybe 15 years, and he goes around and he deals with folks that have coexistence problems. In other words, the beaver are coming in and they're clogging up the road culvert or flooding a road. And Mike has these wonderful flow devices that he puts in, and he's really refined the science on these. And some people call these a beaver deceiver. But with piping and these intake cages within the beaver pond, you're able to control the water level of that pond. And the beaver cannot sense or figure out where the leak is in the dam. And eventually they give up. But they're relatively simple. We install these, around the Mid-Atlantic area for about $1,500 to $2,000. And we're able to provide Department of Public Works folks and others an alternative to just trapping the beaver out, right? Because you trap beaver, you're not relocating them. It's actually illegal to relocate beavers in Maryland. So they're killing these beaver. But this gives us, an alternative to that. And I went up and visited Mike in 2017, and we went around to a lot of the flow devices that he's installed across the Berkshire Mountains. And, they, by and large, I think they were all required almost no maintenance. You can see here the materials are relatively inexpensive, but check out all the wetlands, that are behind these structures, all created and enhanced and maintained by the beaver. Tree protection, obviously, people sort of very upset when the prized dogwood is gnawed, at 3 a.m. by the North American beaver. Well, just, some simple fencing can protect trees. Beaver don't climb over the trees or the cages. So they're relatively easy to protect from beaver damage. It was also at State of the Beaver that I met researchers from the UK, from the University of Exeter, working with the Devon Wildlife Trust. And it was here that I said, wow, like this is amazing. The project they worked on, they took an agricultural ditch that drained a farmland. And because beaver have been eliminated from the UK for hundreds of years, they can't release them back in without putting a fence in. So they did like a 12 acre beaver enclosure. And then they gave the beaver some woody material. And in a few short years, the beaver had converted this ag ditch into a mosaic of wetlands and stream complexes. And then they measured water quality upstream and downstream, the beaver complex. And, they did a lot of really awesome science. And this is available online through the Devon Wildlife Trust. And what they found was like water quality downstream was much better than it was upstream. So, real easy. The bottle on the left is the water coming into the beaver complex, and the water on the right is the water leaving. And they found that in addition to reducing nitrogen, phosphorus, and suspended sediment, the beaver dams also mitigated those high floods. So the graph on the top here is what we call a hydrograph. It's discharge versus time. The line in the blue with the high peak was before they put this enclosure in. They were smart enough to measure discharge and everything before they started. And then the line in the pink is after the beaver complexes are in. So, bring that home to Maryland. Think about if there were some beaver ponds above Ellicott City, right, in Howard County. Wow, that could be a game changer, right? Beaver can do what ecotone can't. We build a lot of stormwater management ponds around the area, and some of these ponds are, get pretty expensive, approaching $1 million a piece. The beavers do it for free. And they do it not only in rural areas, but in urban areas. I'm standing on the bridge on Route 43 in White Marsh, where it crosses over Windlass Run. And there's a 25-acre beaver complex. And think about all the water quality benefits this this system is providing to Endless Run, which flows into the Bird River. And then think about the Bird River, and you may not know this, but Baltimore County spends many, many hundreds, if not millions of dollars trying to keep sediment out of the Bird River because, we like to boat in there and things, and it's generally filling in. Maybe the beaver have a role to play in helping us do that. So some sobering news, beaver management in Maryland, we trap anywhere between and kill anywhere between 1,000 to 3,000 beaver per year. And that's from a guess by the Department of Natural Resources. But they're in every watershed. I've seen beaver in the Jones Falls underneath I-83, Herring Run. They don't know that they're in the city. They're just trying to make a home for themselves. But we're still trying to sort of promote this idea that, if the beavers are flooding or providing or maybe damaging trees, there are ways to mitigate that and coexist with these guys. I pulled this from the hunting regulations in Maryland. They have fur bearer regulations, and look to the right. The bag limit means how many beaver you could take in a day, and see there's no limit. That means that the state is still managing the beaver as a nuisance species. But wait a minute, we just talked about it's got all these great ecosystem benefits that the beaver are providing. Well, honestly, the regulations have not caught up to our enlightened view of the beaver and what it can do for us. Let's talk about history. If you go way back, before as this continent was colonized, before the colonists, there were trappers. The trappers were always the first and always the pioneers, always hitting that frontier. Without beaver, the pilgrims would have perished. It was the pilgrims had nothing to send back on their merchant ships but furs. So they would trade with the indigenous populations for beaver furs. The same thing happened in Maryland. Claiborne was one of the first to colonize Maryland before it was Maryland. He was sort of an offshoot of Jamestown, and he set up a trading post on Kent Island, and he was trading, with the indigenous population for beaver furs, which he was sending back at a great profit back to England. There's a great read by Frederick Falls called "Present at the Creation." He goes through a lot of the early records in Maryland and the Chesapeake Bay. They were trading for thousands of beaver pelts, which indicates that beaver were here, in tremendous numbers back then. They were even using beaver furs as a form of currency. But here's the thing, by like the 1650s, most of the good trading was gone because the beaver had been trapped out. When we talk about history, we talk about the 17th century. Well, this occurred in the 1620s to the 1640s. And it's something that I didn't learn in history class. Why was it so valuable? It was all about hats. So I have a beaver hat here. I'll wear it. I never knew that these kind of hats were made out of beaver fur. Did you? So the hat makers in England would trade with the Russians for furs, but the Russians were kind of a pain in the rear to trade with. That's why the Dutch wanted to make a home here in North America. That's why the French came. That's why the English came. It was all about the fur trade initially. And again, read the bottom passage. On more than one occasion, colonists found themselves so deeply in debt for beaver pelts that they mortgaged or had to put up as security a large portion of their property. Garrett Island, where now Route 40 crosses over the Susquehanna, was a major trading post that Claiborne had set up. And then Lord Baltimore's and all came in and sort of put an end to that, and they won the battle. So, we have this historical evidence that the beaver were here in the millions, right? They sort of dominated all the stream systems in Maryland. I've always been curious, like, what did these streams look like way back when? Well, we tried to find out. We asked an intern to go down to the Maryland archives in Annapolis, and we asked her to pull the initial or the original land grants in Maryland. And here's the thing: the surveyors back then were the only guys with pen and paper writing down what the sort of landscape looked like, and they would describe these points. So our intern looked for words like swamp and marsh and Pocosin, and then she came back and we overlaid the land grants onto Google Earth. And I was able to go out to some of these points and say, hey, where's the marsh? Where's the swamp? And they were gone. I was standing on sort of a dry, high floodplain, but nearby there was a stream or, an entrenched stream that was much lower. Here's the thing, like the beavers would come in and they would turn these areas into swamps. But we've spent the last 300 years ditching, draining, deforesting these areas. So, these streams didn't look probably anything like they do today. This is the Savage River. I was out here fishing with my friend Dan Rodricks, writes for The Sun. He went downstream, I went up, and typically, when you fly fish, you plan to meet later on. So I fished this river, and then I started walking downstream to meet Dan, and the same river turned into this. It happened naturally, but that single thread river, sort of devoid of a lot of structure and wood, turned into this. And actually, this is better and much better ecologically. This may be similar to what our stream systems used to look like way back when. I'll tell you a story about a stream that I've been working on since the early 90s. It's Long Green Creek in Baltimore County. This is what it looked like back in 1993. It was a cow pasture, virtually no trees along the stream. And I worked with the landowner to convince them to put in do some tree planting and put in some willows along the banks. But you can see here the banks just sort of fall in, delivering a lot of sediment to the lower Gunpowder and eventually to the bay. We fenced the cows out, did some work with Trout Unlimited, and then in 2005 I got some funding to do a wetland project here. We finally sort of fenced the cows out of the floodplain and the stream for good. We did a lot of grading and we planted a lot of trees. You can probably know where I'm going now, right? We planted a lot of beaver food, willows, sycamores, maples, and fast forward to 2016, 2017, and that wetland project that Ecotone had built set the stage for the beaver to come in, build a dam, make it much wetter, and make it much better. The landowners noticed that they didn't trap the beaver out and they let the beaver stay. The duck hunting was really good. And they had all these different kinds of ducks that would fly in from Loch Raven. They contacted me and they said, hey, Scott, is there anything we can do for the beaver? And it was flooding a road. So we put in our first flow device here. And the landowner then felt like they had, a little bit of control over the beaver. So the relationship is still, I would say, tenuous, but they've allowed the beaver to stay. Here's the Beaver Lodge in 2019, when they've basically made a family here, what we call a colony. So I'm able to observe these beavers. If you go out at dusk at this site, you can see the beavers. And I saw some kits or young beavers this summer. This is what it looks like in 2020. Quite a bit different, right, from 1993. We turned sort of a dry pasture floodplain into sort of an ecological Narnia, if you will. This is a site where I've been sharing with others the fact that maybe beavers have a real large role to play in restoring function and water quality and resilience to the Chesapeake Bay. Maybe each one of our streams and watersheds needs a couple of beaver ponds on it, right? So we're still doing our part. We're doing a lot of restoration work. We're always thinking about how we can design so that beavers come in and make what we did that much better. So we're planting a lot of willow and alder and dogwood. We're always trying to do landowner education as well. Here's an example project on Bear Cabin Branch in Harford County. This was what it looked like back in 2016. High erosion rates, not much riparian vegetation, trees and shrubs. So this is some of our work sort of stabilizing the stream as we relocated sections of it, using a lot of wood, wet wood we call it, rather than rock. The floodplain, very rough. Some of the neighbors didn't necessarily know what was going on. They said, well, Ecotone, how could they be done? It looks like a war zone down there. It's all wet and swampy. And that's the point. You see this willow tree that we left in the floodplain, it's sending up shoots. That's what it looks like now. We were kind of using nature to revegetate this area. once the neighbors understood why we were leaving things so rough, the idea that ecology is not neat and tidy sometimes. It's very rough. It may even look ugly to us, but ecologically, that's what our friends the beaver are looking for. So the beaver colonized this site within a year and a half. And this is fun. One of the beaver dams that was damaged during a flood, I put up a time lapse camera and captured the beavers. At least I couldn't capture what they were doing at night, but you can see every day the dam gets rebuilt and higher and higher and higher over a period of just 2 weeks. So they move very quickly. They're nocturnal, and they're very good dam builders. They engineer these things, and they'll use whatever they can find. I've seen dams built out of corn stalks, scrap lumber, you name it. So this is yet another project where instead of designing sort of a perfect river channel, with meanders and what we think of as a nice little stream, we turned it into this. It looks kind of swampy and muddy. That was what we were aiming for. But instead of one stream channel, we have several. Ecologically, this site is really, really good. We have instead of 3 sets of aquatic insects in these streams, or one set, we have 3. So we're sort of re-wetting this area of floodplain, measuring our stream restoration in acres rather than feet. This is what it looks like in the summertime, and a lot of these rough areas sort of heal with vegetation over time. So this idea that we're using nature to restore nature, using wood and ecology, sort of an idea of what our streams look like historically. When we design, we're thinking about risk, and this is very low risk. It's simple. We get better ecological outcomes. It sets the table for beavers to come in and make what we did that much better. It retains and processes nutrients. We're slowly but surely sort of trying to change the idea of what restoration really looks like. So with that, Mike Callahan with the Beaver Solutions and the Beaver Institute and I said back in 2019, hey, it's tough for people to go all the way to Western Oregon to learn about beavers. We may have had, I don't know, on the 3rd beer at the hotel bar, we decided we were going to do a conference here in Baltimore. We put on BeaverCon in March 2020, just a week before the pandemic shut everything down. We had folks from Europe, Germany, Alaska, Pacific Northwest, all over the world really coming and talking about beavers and how they're using them for restoration around the world. You all strike me as a group of readers. This is a great book by Frances Backhouse called Once They Were Hats. If you would like to learn more, it's very down to earth, funny, and she puts things in really great terms as far as the fur trade. And she's from Victoria, so it's got sort of a Canadian tilt to it, eh? She's become a great friend. Mike Callahan, by the way, he's in the beaver suit. Turns out, we bought Ecotone bought that mascot a couple of years ago just for fun, and we've been in the 4th of July parade with it here in Baltimore, or in Bel Air, excuse me. Here's another great book by Ben Goldfarb called Eager. I met him at State of the Beaver as well, and he went around the world and talked and looked at, sort of immersed himself in some of the research that people are doing with the North American beaver. Last but not least, Derek Gow. This book just came out called Bringing Back the Beaver, and it's his story of trying to re-beaver the UK, England, and Scotland. He's a hilarious guy. He shut down the bar every night at BeaverCon. The work he's doing is really incredible over in England. So with that, I'll play this video that I took with my iPhone at dusk. And this is not any fancy filmmaking operation here, but they come out right, maybe 15 minutes before dark. Sometimes you can catch them. It's been a great place to go, socially distanced for me. It's on my way home from work, and it's been fun getting to know these little guys. So while we watch it, if anyone has questions, throw them out. We're right in the middle of suburbia, folks, and we have they've created this beautiful habitat, and and they get up every night at 3 a.m. and maintain it for us. So any other questions?